Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you can hear me loud and clear and probably even see me, depending on what sort of device you're joining me on. My name's Tony. I'm your host for this session, and in fact, a whole series of sessions we've got coming up on managing tantrums. I hope you're aware of that. This is in fact a course. Tonight is the first session. I'm going to explain a bit more about how this will work. But hopefully we're all on the same page. Most of you will have come here through Raising Children Network, the website, signed up, probably been wondering a little bit about exactly what you're going to get, and so you're going to find that out tonight. This is what we call a webinar, and I'll explain to you a bit how that's going to work and how you might get the best out of these sessions in a second. But tonight is the first session, Tantrums. We're going to be looking at an overview of why tantrums happen and what we might be able to do about it. And we're going to be using an evidence-based method of tackling tantrums. So you can have some confidence that it's actually going to make a difference to you. So it sounds like I'm coming through okay. So what is a webinar? Well, a key feature is that it's live, right? I'm really here right now at our office in Melbourne, and I'm talking to you live, which means that there's some positives and negatives. The positives are we have a chance to interact throughout the session. You'll be able to, ask me questions, and I've built in some interactivity for you as well. The negatives are, if you're comparing it to something like YouTube or other videos you might have seen on Raising Children Network or around the place, the quality is not going to be quite as good because I'm kind of doing it live and you're going to hear all my ums and ahs and stumbles, and I don't get any second takes. There are also some limitations of the technology, which means sometimes my audio will go a bit funny, sometimes the video might look a bit funny. There's not too much we can do about that. Eventually technology might catch up and maybe the NBN will help. Who knows? Let's see. So that's the best way you can kind of participate is probably in the first instance using the chat box. Now, if you're on a computer of some sort, that should be somewhere over that side, down the bottom on the left there. You can feel free to type in that. People are already doing this, as you might be able to see. We've got quite a lot of people joining us tonight, so there should be lots of discussion in the chat box, which is great. From time to time, I'll respond to your questions as well. If you're on another sort of device, there might be more limited functionality. I'm sorry about that. Those apps might catch up in the near future, but for now, we're kind of stuck with what we've got. So let's move on. Hopefully, the technology will become clear in terms of what we're aiming for here. One other thing I should mention about this webinar is who it's for. I think we advertised that it's generally for children aged about 2 to 12 years. That's kind of a rough estimate. Really, it's aimed at anyone who's dealing with tantrums in their children. And we'll talk more about exactly what a tantrum is in a second, which could be at any age and will vary depending on the kind of developmental status of your child. So we've aimed this content to also be suitable for parents who have children with additional needs. That's very important. But it'll work just as well if you have a typically developing child. If your child does have additional needs, a disability of some sort, maybe intellectual disability, autism spectrum, Down syndrome, anything like that, it can lead to more tantrums and tantrums persisting for longer. The approach that we're talking tonight will work quite well for those sorts of children as well. Hope that makes sense. Hope that suits you. Before I go any further, I should do a couple of acknowledgements. First is the Victorian government, who have generously provided support for this project. These webinars that we're offering are kind of a new thing that we're trying out and hoping work well and hoping that they suit parents' needs. So we're still sort of in a trial phase, and the Victorian government's been very supportive of us and provided funding, which is why this is completely free to you guys. It also happens to be free to anyone around Australia or even the world, just because it doesn't cost us anymore to expand the population that we can reach to because of the technology, which is great. So thanks, Victorian Government. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on tonight. That's a bit complicated because we might be all over the place, all around Australia, and we'll have different traditional owners depending on where you are. I'm here in Melbourne, and the Wurundjeri people are the traditional owners of the land I'm on. So I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people we may have in the audience today. Now, you might notice I'm talking a little bit quickly. That's because we've got quite a lot to get through. I'll tell you more about how that works in a second. I hope I'm not going too fast or too slow. I'm trying to get the pacing about right. Now, my name's Tony Gates. I'll tell you a little bit about myself because you're probably wondering who this is coming from. I'm a psychologist, and with particular expertise in working with children and parents. That's one of the main things I focus on. And I've worked in a range of settings like schools, private practice, doing assessments, interventions, behaviour management, all that kind of thing. And I also happen to be a parent myself. I've got an 8-year-old son. You can, if you want to read more about me or presenters for some of the other webinars we're running, check out Raising Children Network. It's got some further information on there. Another person I'll introduce you to is Kim, who is our facilitator tonight. You probably already worked that out because she's talking to you in the chat box. Kim C is Kim. She works with me here at the Parenting Research Centre. So her role will be kind of to keep an eye on what you guys are talking about in chat, help out where she can. She'll keep track of questions for me, that kind of thing. So feel free to talk to Kim as well as we go along. Now, this topic that we're talking about, parenting, managing tantrums, it's a bit of a sensitive issue, or it can be, because it really matters to us and it can be quite personal. So you know how I said this is live, I'm a real person talking to you through a camera. Everyone else here is also a real person, so just bear that in mind. We've got many parents, grandparents, relatives, professionals, whoever joining us in the chat box. All of them are real people, so just be aware of that when you're commenting and make sure that we're kind of supportive and respectful of each other. If you are concerned or upset about anything we're talking about tonight, or if you generally feel like you're really struggling, I do recommend that you seek further support. The reason is I'm fairly limited in what I can do for you in such a large group setting over the internet, right? The best I can do is give you some general advice that's not going to be quite tailored to your situation perfectly. If you're struggling, it's likely that you'll need some more personal one-on-one support, and there are some ideas for how to do that on the screen. Raising Children Network can refer you to some stuff if you check that out. There's a service called Parent Line, which can refer you to some stuff if you check that out. There's a service called Parent Line, which is, I believe, in every state around Australia. You can look that up and find the number there. There's Lifeline, which is also a free service. And Raising Children Network also has a section on hotlines if you want to check that out. Another good option is to go see a GP or a mental health expert, child behaviour expert, like a psychologist. Now, a bit more about this course, because it's not just a one-off session. Tell you what, I might take myself off the screen for a moment. This isn't a computer glitch. I'm going to take myself off the screen just to kind of give you a break from my face. And also it might help your bandwidth a bit for some people. You might find that the audio is a little bit better when I'm not on the screen. So I'm going to disappear now, but it's okay. I'm still here, don't panic. So this course is, like we mentioned, all about managing tantrums. It's going to be 7 sessions spaced out over the next 8 weeks. We will have a break the week after the next because it's a public holiday here in Victoria. I'll remind you about that next session. And just a note, we have run this course previously. We ran it in sort of June and July. If you did it last time, that's great. It is the same content. But as you will learn throughout this course, it is a very good idea to revisit this content. It usually takes a few goes to make this stick. And you'll have an opportunity to revisit if you've done it before. And you can ask me questions, tell me how you're going. You'll also, if you're a new participant, have a chance to review it using recordings that we'll share later. So don't worry too much if you can't take it all in this session, which is going to be pretty quick going. What we're going to use in this course, what I'm going to be teaching you about, is something called functional assessment. This is kind of a tried and true approach in psychology that has a long history and has some of the best data supporting it. So there's some good reason to believe that it actually works. You might have heard of it before. The main idea of functional assessment is it's what's called a sort of ecological approach, which is a fancy way of saying we look at all the circumstances around the behavior. So we look at everything that's going on when tantrums are happening, and we try and work out why the tantrum is happening. Then we try and change some of those factors to reduce the likelihood of the tantrum happening again in the future. I hope that makes sense. That's a very rough overview of what is quite an in-depth approach. But the other thing about functional assessment is it's not a quick fix. So in this course, I'm not going to be chucking out ideas left and right because unfortunately they may not make much difference to you. They might make you feel better a little bit in the short term, but they're not going to kind of tackle the root of the problem the same way functional assessment can in the long term. So functional assessment, we kind of want to get to the point where we're teaching your child new ways of behaving that can take over from the tantrum. Don't worry if that doesn't make much sense to you now. We've got lots of time to go through that. And also bear in mind that it's not a cure-all for everything. There are some things that functional assessment aren't going to solve for you that might be related to what's going on with your child or children you're around. One would be emotional disturbances. It's not really a fix for something like mood disorders. It can actually be beneficial and won't do any harm in that context, but you might be better off with something else to help with that, or something as well. It doesn't really, it's not an attachment program per se. If you're worried about how your attachment with your child or the state of your relationship, it doesn't target that directly. Again, it can help incidentally by kind of taking some stress out and making things work better. And it's also going to not a facilitated communication program. So if you've got a child with additional needs, that might be something else to look into that would help, helping a child to communicate their needs better. This is what the course is going to look like. A whole bunch of sessions, 7 of them. The first one is tonight, which is kind of a standalone session. What we're going to do is I'm going to give you an overview of the whole approach, which is a lot. This is this content is taken from a course that we developed at the Parenting Research Center and evaluated and works really well. It's designed to be delivered over sort of 6 or 7 face-to-face sessions that go for 2 hours each. So we're trying to squeeze about 15 hours worth of content into less than 7. And I'm going to try and cover an overview of all of that tonight. So we're going to be moving pretty quickly. I don't expect you to remember that or be able to apply it all at once. It's just so that you kind of know what you're getting yourself into. But I also don't want you to leave empty-handed. So I'm going to give you some 5 tips that I think you can start using straight away and that will start making a difference to your child's behavior. Then the next 3 sessions are kind of another level in this course, all right? And they will be building on or going to more depth in the things we talk about tonight. So that's when you'll actually be able to start doing some of this stuff and getting your teeth stuck in. And week by week, I'll be giving you exercises to do at home that you can kind of start working at stuff and see how it's going and give me feedback saying, yeah, this is good, or Tony, this is rubbish, what are you talking about? And we'll see if I can help you with that. So there's 3 sessions there. I won't bother reading those out to you at this stage. And then the last level, another 3 sessions, is again going into more depth in some of the concepts that we discussed in the previous 2 levels And there'll be more chance for kind of discussion and interaction and you letting me know how it's going in your family. So that's what it looks like. I hope you're okay with that. You've got 7 sessions ahead of you if you want to get the most out of this approach. Brace yourselves or prepare yourselves or organize stuff as best you can so that you can attend as many sessions as possible. I really strongly recommend that because we know that's going to influence the quality of the result that you get. I know that's a lot to ask of busy parents or busy people in general, particularly if you're dealing with tantrums. You probably don't have a lot of time or energy to spare. Do what you can, catch up on the recordings if you miss some, and stick around for as long as you can. All right, so let's go on to what we're going to cover tonight. Here's our outline, all right? First topic we're going to cover is how to work out the purpose of the tantrum, which is, I think, a pretty exciting step. Once people get their heads around that, they usually find that quite satisfying. Next, we're going to talk about giving effective instructions, which again might be a fairly short topic, but an important one. Next, we'll move on to providing consequences and how that's involved in managing tantrums. Then we'll talk about the long term of managing tantrums. So like I mentioned, functional assessment doesn't really change anything instantly. It's more about changing the likelihood of tantrums happening over time. I'll talk to you about how to make sure that works best for you. Then we'll get on to how you can teach your child new skills so that the tantrum kind of isn't necessary anymore, hopefully, if that goes to plan. And then we'll go on to how to use rules effectively. We completed that poll. Hopefully that worked. It may not have gone entirely to plan due to that technical glitch, but I can tell you most of us have a 2 or 3-year-old, followed by 0 to 1 years old, a few in the 4 or 5-year-old brackets, and a few smatterings in the other age groups as well. So there's a good spread. Many of us have a 2 or 3-year-old, which is to be expected, really. That's sort of peak time for tantrums. So I'm not surprised to see so many of you here concerned about a child in that age bracket. Amber, is this, of course, appropriate for an 18-month-old? Yes, it is. The principles will apply. The examples and stuff aren't as tailored to an 18-month-old. But yes, it is appropriate for an 18-month-old. And by all means, continue to ask me questions about your particular circumstances once we get into the particular methods involved in this approach. So we did the poll. I hope that worked. As well, I know it didn't. So anyway. All right, let's move on to our first topic, which is how you work out the purpose of behavior. Should be useful to you. Oh, great. Is it freezing again? No. Okay, I'm all right. Now, when we say purpose, just a quick note for you, we don't mean purpose in the sense of a child doing it on purpose. What we mean is the function of the behavior. So it's not the same as saying, oh, we've worked out the purpose, now we can say, naughty child, stop doing it on purpose. Purpose in this context just means how the behavior works, why it's happening the way it is. Before we go into that, we need a little bit of context so that we're on the same page with some background information about tantrums, all right? See if this rings true to you, and if you have anything else to add, by all means, mention that in the chat box. So tantrums are extremely common, folks, especially in children under 4 years of age. They tend to taper off after that in typically developing children, but we know they can persist in all sorts of children after 4, but that's kind of the critical period. And so it's certainly not unusual if your child is having tantrums. They can be very different from child to child. Not sure if you're familiar with that, but the tantrum that your child has might be very different from the tantrum that my child has, or Amanda's child has, or Belinda's child has. And we might think we're talking about the same thing when actually quite different things are happening. All right, so this little quote from Raising Children Network sort of illustrates that point. It's not the most precise definition, but it's useful for getting our heads in the right space. So tantrums can involve spectacular explosions of anger, frustration, and disorganized behavior, which is when your child loses it. You might see crying, screaming, stiffening limbs, an arched back, kicking, falling down, flailing about or running away. In some cases, children hold their breath, vomit, break things, or get aggressive as part of a tantrum. There's a huge range of stuff in there. Your child might do all or any of those, or something different as well. But one thing that comes clear there is they can be a bit spectacular, and they're quite full on often when they happen. Or that you might have more of a sedate kind of tantrum as well. That's also important. Another thing we know about tantrums is they tend to drive parents nuts, all right? They're very frustrating because they're so kind of pointless and over the top that sometimes you're looking at a child having a tantrum thinking, why is this going on? And if you get a lot of them, they lead to you sort of pulling your hair out. That's important, but they affect us as parents, or many of us. And that's something we'll tackle in level 3 of the course, one of those later sessions. So the first thing I want you to think about with tantrums is what else is going on at the time. This is really important for how we work out the purpose. And I'm going to go through a little example here. You can play along at home and see what you think. Here's a little scenario. Now you might notice there's no tantrum happening in this scenario. That's okay, and it's sort of on purpose because I want to broaden the way you think to things, to behavior in general, because that will help you understand the principles I'm getting at. So you can see in this scene, hopefully you can all see that there's a number of features. We're going to go through a way of thinking about this scene that you can then apply to your child's tantrums to make sense of them, all right? And there's a few questions I want to ask you about this scene. First of all, where are we? Have a look at the picture. You won't be able to tell exactly, but you might be able to have a guess. It looks to me kind of like a suburban street. It's kind of leafy. Maybe we're near a school because the kids are on bikes and a skateboard. And it's looks pretty sunny. So think about your child's tantrums. Where do they tend to happen? Or the child who you're concerned about. The next question we want to ask is who's involved in this scenario? Now I can see a few people here. We've got a girl on the skateboard there. We've got a boy on the bike. And a person over here, let's have a guess, say she's maybe mum or another carer, auntie, something like that. We can just list those. That's not too controversial, right? But you might also, that's important who they are. Are these two brother and sister? Is that in fact their mum? All of these are relevant to understanding what behavior is going on in the scenario. Next, what's going on? What's the kind of activity in this scenario? What are people doing? Well, we've got the kids in school uniforms and they're on their skateboard and their bike. If I was to guess, I'd say maybe they're riding to or from school. And the mum's there doing something with the boy, maybe helping him out, maybe he's learning to ride, and she's helping him with his balance or giving him a push to help him get up the hill. And the final question you want to ask about the situation is when is it happening? This is one that often gets overlooked. What is the time of day? Is it morning or afternoon? And also, what other events have gone on recently or are coming up soon? So if school is coming up soon, that's relevant, or maybe school is just finished. They're maybe going to get home soon. Maybe they're going to visit someone soon. It's sunny, that's relevant, particularly if you've got a child with sensory sensitivities, or if it's windy, that might be relevant to you. We need to think in as much detail about this situation as we can. So that's just an example. I know there's no tantrum in here, but that's to get you thinking beyond just the tantruming. So this gets us to our first practical tip, folks, which is to write a list of situations where tantrums happen. Rate how severe or frequent the tantrums are and look for patterns. So we're going to use this process that I was just talking to you about, where you're kind of analysing these situations to try and look for patterns. So you'll do that in more than one situation, and eventually you'll build up a picture of the sort of tantrums your child tends to have, and which is going to feed into working out why they happen, which is our next point. People are asking about if they can review this on the recording. Yes, absolutely, you can do that. It'll be a bit of a different experience because it's not live and interactive. So I probably won't get as much out of it, but there will be a recording sent around later. I'm sorry that was technical. Now, the next thing, once you've looked at those, or the next thing in working out the purpose is looking at the tantrums results. Now, this is pretty simple. One most important thing is, how do people react? The tantrum happens. There's other people around, probably, as we just looked at in that little scene. How do they react? What do they do? Are they, interacting with the child a lot, trying to get them to calm down? Are they ignoring the child? Are they trying to distract the child? Are they bringing in more activities? Are they bringing in other people? How do people react? And the other question to ask yourself is, what is your child doing 5 minutes later? This is really important because it's going to tell you about how that tantrum is working in your child's world. Now, when we're putting all this together to work out the purpose, don't be fooled by how the behaviour looks at first glance. We're going to go through this systematically and try and work out the purpose over a range of situations. This is because you can't always see exactly what's going on in the tantrum. A child might act like it's serving a particular purpose when internally something else is going on that you can't actually see. That's because a child's internal states can be a bit childish. So, I want you to be confident to have a guess. It doesn't matter too much if you get it wrong at this stage. But see if you can start to work out what the purpose might be, and you can refine it as you go along. Now, we've got some ideas to prompt you in the right direction. This is really important, folks. This is an important part of the course where we talk about the possible purposes. There are 6 of them based on this functional assessment approach. And you should be able to slot your child's tantrum into one of these purposes. Wouldn't that be exciting? So you can see on the left we've got the get category. On the right we've got the escape category. And the first category of the rank is attention. So some children will have tantrums to get attention. This is a big one, and one that you may have been made aware of as a possibility already. That sometimes tantrums result in a lot of attention to the child. Now, just because it results in attention doesn't mean that that's the purpose, but it's one to consider. Similarly, it could be to escape attention. This could be, it's not uncommon in children with additional needs. I've worked with children who have an autism spectrum disorder who would have a tantrum trying to escape the attention of, say, their classmates or a childcare worker, or maybe a grandparent or parent. So escape attention is also a possibility. Next, consider activity. One possible purpose is to get access to an activity. Maybe there's something your child really likes to do. They have a tantrum, and it seems that afterwards they end up doing this particular activity. You may not even be aware that it's necessarily an activity they like. It might be something strange that you wouldn't think is all that desirable. But as we go through this approach, you'll be able to work out, is that really what's going on? Another possibility is escape an activity. Maybe your child really doesn't like doing something like, I'm sure you can think of some classics here, folks. Going to bed, eating dinner, getting dressed. Those are classics for escape activities. Another possibility is to get a certain sensation. So maybe that's wearing some of their favorite clothes, maybe that's playing with a certain toy that they like, maybe that's listening to certain sounds that they enjoy, or maybe it's to escape a sensation. We know that many kids can have sensory sensitivities, a bit of a mouthful, which can come up as they scratch clothes, breezes, loud noises, bright sunlight, and the tantrum could be functioning to try and escape that sensation. All right, so those are the 6 purposes. We'll go through these in much more detail in the next session. So that's just to kind of get you thinking at this stage. So remember, we can't be sure at this stage. We make a guess and we can improve as we go. Anna has a question about describing the behaviour, which is it gets to the point where your daughter hurts herself and she can't seem to stop the tantrum. What category would that be? My answer is, I don't know at this stage. That's kind of a description of what goes on during the tantrum, not the circumstances around it. Right? So in this approach, I'll guide you through kind of working out, right, what's going on before the tantrum, what's going on at the time of the tantrum, and what happens after the tantrum, and how that contributes to work out what the purpose of the tantrum is. Now, next question we'll ask in this approach is, once we know the purpose, is the purpose acceptable? Sometimes your child is having a tantrum for a purpose where that underlying purpose is acceptable, even if you don't like the tantrum. Say it's to get a drink. Your child's thirsty, they want a drink of water, and it turns into a tantrum because you couldn't get it quick enough or something like that. Now we'd say, that's okay. Children are allowed to be thirsty. We want them to be able to drink when they're thirsty. But the tantrum is not acceptable. So we separate the behavior from the purpose. And that's going to be really important later on when we're trying to replace tantrums with other behavior. Because we'll do that based on the purpose. I know I'm going kind of switch place. This is a lot of info to throw at you. And like I said, it's tricky with the timing and the pacing of this session. But I just wanted to give you an overview of kind of what you can expect so that you can kind of suss out how is this going to work and what am I going to get out of this course. All right, next topic is giving effective instructions. All right, so you know how we were just talking about, is the purpose acceptable? That's really powerful information, because if the answer is yes, we have a real opportunity to help your child do something else that's more important, more appropriate. We can replace the behavior with something better. If it's not an acceptable purpose, then we just want to guide them towards something else, more, generally more positive or helpful. And I'll explain how to do that later. Either way, you're going to be giving them instead behavior, something to do instead. And we're going to work really hard to make that happen. Which brings us to practical tip number 2. This will all be summarized in the handout, by the way. So remember, a child can't do nothing at all. They can't just stop existing or just not do anything. Which is important if you find yourself falling into the trap of saying stop or don't a lot. Stop it, don't do that. They tend not to be so effective as approaches where you direct them towards something to do instead. So think about, in your child's case, what's something they could do instead? Again, you'll get more info on how to do this later, but to start, something you could try at home. If they're having a tantrum, do something else. And once we've got that in mind, we can get it happening. The way we might do that is by giving effective instructions. Here's an opportunity for you guys to participate. I'm interested in your ideas for what's involved in giving effective instructions. If you're not sure, you might be able to make some up based on looking at that picture. Otherwise, maybe your own ideas, and I'll go through in a second and see what we think. I'm going to put some thinking music on. Let's see if this works. This is pushing my luck, isn't it, this evening? There may or may not be some. So I haven't gone away. thanks for talking amongst yourselves, folks. You're doing a better job of this than me. Just wait for the slides to load back up. So we had some great ideas about giving effective instructions. I saw in the chat before I went on hiatus. With things like getting down to their level, making eye contact, these are great suggestions. Using gestures is very effective as well. Here are some other ideas that we had. Using the child's name to get their attention, waiting until you got a response, giving one instruction at a time. Positive consequences are also really important if you do get compliance. If they do what you ask, it's a good idea to use positive consequence, particularly if you're trying to get past tantrums. Obviously, we'll go into that more in future sessions. I'm going to start moving a bit fast. These technical issues have slowed us down a bit. Luckily, these topics aren't too long, but I won't go into too much detail in them because we'll cover them in more detail later anyway. So we'll have a range of ideas for positive consequences, right? The main ones I want to draw your attention to here, and I'm very tempted to draw on this, I've annotated again, but I'm not going to risk it at this stage. One is attention, as you can see in the middle there. Don't underestimate the power of attention, both for good and evil, folks. It can work really well to reinforce a good behavior or a replacement behavior that you want. So if you get it, think of a way to give your child attention when they do the right thing. It could be something, it doesn't have to be a whole lot. It could be 5 minutes sitting down watching a show that they like with them, or just sitting there with them while they do something. That can be really powerful. Another important one is that one in pink, labeled praise. That just means saying what your child did that you liked and kind of thanking them for it. Saying, good job, you played gently with your brother. Good job, you talked to me nicely. That kind of thing. And we want to crumple up and remove any positive consequence for the tantrum, just as a side note. Sometimes we don't realize that we're inadvertently providing a positive consequence for the tantrum, which is reinforcing it. So we want to make sure that goes out the window. So this brings us to practical tip number 3, which is to catch your child being good. I would say this is probably the most important tip that I can give you at this stage. You almost want to be on the lookout for good behavior. Unfortunately, if you've got a lot of difficult behavior, a lot of tantrums, we spend a lot of our time and effort putting out fires, trying to stop all this difficult behavior. And the good behavior, even if it's a very small amount of it going on, doesn't get as much attention. So we almost want to get a bit ridiculous with this, where we're thanking or praising or giving positive attention for really small instances of positive behavior. If that's all you get, that's what you've got to single out. Thanks for sitting there while I was talking on the phone, or thanks for picking up that toy, or thanks for putting on your shirt. Or anytime you're reinforcing and commenting on something that's going well, it's much more powerful than picking up the negatives and trying to correct them. All right, think long term is basically about planning ahead for situations. This whole approach is very much based on planning ahead, as I'm sure you're picking up already. But particularly you can plan ahead for high-risk situations and develop a strategy for those situations in particular. Some situations are more likely to lead to tantrums than others, and we'll have a whole lot of details of things to watch out for in future situations. But you probably have some ideas for your family what the kind of trigger situations are. Some classics are like going shopping, visiting relatives, talking on the phone, dinner time. So we can try and work with these situations, change them a bit to reduce the risk. You can also consider a workaround in the short term so that you're not doing so much of these high-risk situations. And the whole idea is just to try and get more good behavior that you can reinforce rather than having to try and stop the negative behavior all the time. Part of this is also tracking behavior over time. I won't go into this too much. The next session, right now, the next session has a lot of info on tracking behavior over time, how to do that effectively and efficiently, so I won't go into that now. But it's one that's often overlooked. And it's one that annoys people because you have to write stuff down and remember to do it. It's annoying. But it's important. And we'll go through some ways that you can do that, like the behaviour diary. You can keep a tally. You can use something called an interval record. Or you can come up with your own system. So that's all the practical tip number 4 is. Just come up with some sort of system to track your child's behaviour over time. How many over time? I'm interested in things like how many tantrums does your child have a week? Or how long on average do the tantrums last from week to week or from day to day? And that's also good because you can see if what you're doing is helping in the long run. Now, part of this is also how we describe behaviour, which is in lots of detail, if you can. If I say to you a child had a tantrum, it doesn't really tell the whole story, does it? Like we heard earlier, there's all sorts of stuff that can go on, kicking, screaming, holding breath, vomiting. It could be almost anything involved. So I want you to start trying to work in more detail. And one way you can do that is using something we call the telephone test. So how you do this is you imagine yourself describing the tantrum to a friend on the phone. You want to make sure you have enough detail that they can understand exactly what happened. They had a clear picture, right? And you can do that yourself. Imagine describing it. What's the person on the other end of the phone going to be thinking? This is to force you to be really specific. And we'll return to the telephone test later. Teaching new skills is the core of functional assessment, all right? One of those that we're going to be particularly interested in is communication. Now, you might be able to guess how this comes in. If your child, if we've worked out the purpose of the tantrums, there could be a big element of communication in there because the child's not able to get those needs met in another way because they're not telling you what they are. The other area we target is skills of independence. This is helping a child to do things for themselves so that there's not so much frustration building up over time. Now, this can be small things like getting a glass of water, walking, fine motor skills, dressing, through to bigger things like negotiating with you, asking for things that they want, talking to other people, socializing. And there's a particular way that we want to do this that involves not so much talking, more showing, more guiding. There's a whole, I think nearly a whole session that we spend on that in level 3. So that brings us to our last practical tip, folks. Thank you for your patience and your continued attention, by the way. This tip is just teach your child, or try and work out some skills that you think would help your child, focusing probably on independence and communication to help them meet their own needs before the need for a tantrum arises. It basically gives the child a better way of doing things so that tantrums don't eventuate as often. Last topic is just some notes on rules that I wanted to give you at this stage because I think that can be useful. Some of this you might be aware of already. Now, don't get too hung up on rules. Rules aren't really a behavior management approach on their own. They work well when they're combined with our other efforts, right? So they fit well with functional assessment. If you're setting household rules, make sure they're specific and include consequences. So this is important for tantrums as well, that you spell out for your child what it is that you don't like about the tantrum and what it is that the consequence will be. So, and you're going to need to use your specific description for that. So if you say tantrums aren't allowed, it's not going to cut it. It's going to have to be things like, well, hitting isn't allowed. If you hit, you go in timeout. Or if you hit, you don't get access to this thing that you want. So you need to be specific about it. And there's a few other ideas there too. So that brings us to the end of this fast-moving, comprehensive overview of functional assessment. Don't worry if you didn't take it all in, and I know it's a bit of a whirlwind tour. The course is going to be very practical and applied, I promise. There's going to be lots of chances for you to discuss how it's going and try and work out, all right, that's all very well, Tony, but how does that work with my particular child and in my family? On that note, we're very interested in what you think. Because this is a new service that we're offering, we need your input to improve it, and I'll read this from week to week and maybe even try and change things to make it better for you as we go through. So there'll be a link there which Kim will share in the chat room, and will also open automatically if you're on a computer when I end the session, or if you click the end session button yourself. So if you do have time to stick around for that, we really appreciate it. And we also really appreciate the many of you who took the time to complete the survey that we included at the point of registration, which was a bit longer than this one. This one doesn't take nearly so long. It's only a few minutes. So we won't recap that right now because we're going to have some question and answer time for the last 5 minutes or so. But I want to remind you, if you're concerned or upset, do seek further support. And do remember to come back next week, which is where we're going to get stuck into sort of the meat and potatoes of understanding your child's tantrum. It doesn't have the sexiest title, next week's session, looking at your child's environment, but it is quite exciting, I think, in terms of what you might get out of it, in terms of understanding your child's tantrum. So put that in your diaries and try and work out the best way to attend that if you can. And also we'll be sharing a recording and handout later in this week. It will take a couple of days to come through, but rest assured that will be coming through. So what we'll do now is, I'll pause for a second, okay? I'm going to stop talking. Don't panic. I know you're going to suspect it's a technical issue because odds would say that's what it is. But it's not. I'm going to stop talking for about 30 seconds. Feel free to put your questions through, or I'll have a look at other ones that Kim's been gathering that you've raised already. And then we'll have a bit of a chat, see if I can help you with some of those. All right. So I'm going to mute myself. Don't panic. I'll be back in a second. All right, I'm back, folks. I can see a lot of you sending in questions. Now, if I don't get to all of them, I apologize. That's just, we've only got so much time. Rest assured, if you are able to come back and keep sessions, you'll have plenty of opportunities to ask questions. And the sad news is not everyone sticks around for the whole course. So if you can make it to the later sessions in particular, lucky you will get more individualized. So we had a question from Serena about how early is normal. Your son, Serena, is 15 months and starting to have tantrums. I wouldn't worry too much about how early is normal. Basically, if they're capable of having a tantrum, that's pretty normal. It just depends on their developmental stage, their size. And next session, we're going to go through our sort of whole theory of why tantrums happen. We're going to get a bit psychological about it. And I think it'll make sense to you why I'm giving you this answer then. So it sort of just depends on your child's understanding of the world and the sort of frustrations that build up for them. So I would say it's not anything to be particularly concerned about that your son is 15 and starting, but of course it's not the most fun time for you, so I feel for you. Nikki, you had a question about redirecting. If your child is only 2 and may not understand the language that you're trying to use. So we, just to reiterate that question, There's a big emphasis in this course on not relying on language, particularly in young children. We know it doesn't work, and particularly if they're having a tantrum. You've probably noticed this yourselves, that it's very hard to reason with a child who's having a tantrum, and I very much recommend that you don't try and do too much of that. So in later sessions, when we talk about consequences or responding to tantrums, I've got a kind of specific way of dealing with this that tells you not to do too much talking. Keep your talking to a minimum. So I definitely agree with you, Nikki. Redirecting is one option, but basically we want to use behavioural responses rather than talking ones. I'm going to go through some of the other questions that we had here. Forgive me for looking away from the camera. Oh, there are so many good questions. All right, I'm not going to get to all of these. We had a question from N, my good friend N, about are timeouts still considered appropriate? Timeout is a topic that we expect to get lots of questions about in this course, and that we cover in some depth in a later session. I think it's session number 3, maybe session number 4. I think it's session number 3. So we go into depth about timeout. The issue with timeout is there's a lot of misinformation about it. So timeout is a good idea and does work well and is safe and is appropriate if you do it right. Unfortunately, some people advocate for a method of timeout that isn't such a good idea, and some people get upset about the idea of timeout when they're not actually talking about timeout, they're talking about something else that I would not consider a proper way to do timeout. So we'll cover the proper way to do timeout, and then you can decide if that suits you. Isn't it? We've got some questions about the specifics of responding to certain behaviours and what you do kind of in the moment. Like I mentioned, we'll discuss that in more detail in future sessions, but just a word of warning. Functional assessment, if we're going to be really effective with it, is not a kind of, all right, you can say something in the moment or do something in the moment that's going to kind of break the spell of the tantrum and diffuse the whole situation. It doesn't really work that way. And in fact, often the most you can do once a tantrum's in full flight is just try and keep them safe and try not to make it any worse until they kind of eventually wear themselves out. So we don't focus too much on sort of magic bullets in the moment. It's more about the circumstances around the tantrum so that we can change it over time, which tends to be much more effective anyway. I'm going to turn off my screen again because I feel strange reading with my eyes down sideways while trying to answer some of these questions. We might just do a couple more because I know it's getting late. It's 9 o'clock on a Tuesday and we're really testing your concentration, aren't we? So Sarah had a point about if you have more than one child in the picture. Sarah, you mentioned you have 3 boys and constant fighting is part of your whole sort of tantrum story. That is an extra complication, isn't it? And I know that's one that comes up often. What do we do about the sibling factor? Maybe the child you're most concerned about is set off when they're interacting with their sibling, or when someone doesn't go their way, or they're supposed to be sharing, or the other one presses their buttons. That's a complicating factor, and one that we will talk about a little bit in detail in one of the later sessions. Unfortunately, there's not too much good news there, in that it does just mean that there's extra work for you. One little tip on that is, a poorly kept secret is, although we're talking about tantrums tonight, this approach actually works very well for all sorts of difficult behavior. So you can actually apply this approach once you understand it and once you've gone through it to other children's behavior as well. So you can use it for siblings, even if it's not tantrums that they're struggling with there. All right. So folks, we might leave it there. We're out of time. I know many of you had questions that you wanted me to get to. I'll check out what some of those were during the week and see if I can knock some of them off at the start of next session. So come along for that, and of course you'll have plenty more opportunities to ask your questions in future sessions. Thank you for sticking around during question time. What will happen now is I'll end the session and it will open automatically for most of you our post-webinar survey. And if you do have time to fill that out, that would be really appreciated. We do take your feedback seriously. Otherwise, I will be back here next week again at 8 o'clock Tuesday night, Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time. You will get a new link to the next webinar via your email. So don't use the same link from this time. You'll get a new one. Just keep an eye on your email. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great evening. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.